everyone. Welcome to our discussion of the civil unrest in Spain that's in relation to the Catalonian independence movement. My name is Mary Chapman. I'm Manager of Client Communications at WorldAware, and I'll be moderating for today's briefing. I would now like to introduce Ben Plain. Ben is an intelligence analyst on the Europe-Russia CIS team with a focus on Western Europe. He has experience researching and analyzing international political risk both professionally and academically. Ben is going to provide an overview of the disruption you can expect to see and how it could impact your organization. Ben?
Thank you. So for a brief bit of background, the Catalonian independence movement is the issue at the heart of the protests taking place in Barcelona and throughout the wider region at the moment. And ultimately this stems from a failed illegal independence referendum that the regional government attempted to hold on October the 1st, 2017. Madrid subsequently dissolved the Catalonian parliament and arrested a number of the movement's leaders, only reinstating the region's autonomy in 2018. And since the failed referendum, the Catalonian independence movement has been the cause of the majority of civil unrest in the region. Pro-independence civil society groups regularly stage protests that draw tens of thousands, and though there have been isolated clashes with security services, they have previously been largely peaceful. So onto the current protests. Developments relating to the failed independence referendum have consistently resulted in the surge of pro-independence protests and demonstrations. And in the most significant development since 2017, the Spanish Supreme Court sentenced 9 of the movement's leaders on October the 14th. It is this sentencing that has caused the current wave of protests. Immediately following the announcement, hundreds of thousands of participants flooded the streets of Catalonia to condemn the verdict in a coordinated action led by well-established independence organisations, but supported by a number of grassroots and decentralised social media groups. Since October the 14th, pro-independent civil society groups, led by the Catalan National Assembly and Òmnium Cultural, have staged daily protests throughout Catalonia, but concentrated in the urban centres of Barcelona, Lleida, Girona, and Tarragona, drawing massive attendance. The most significant recent action was a 3-day march from 5 cities beginning on October the 16th and converging in Barcelona last Friday for a massive demonstration. The marches took place along major highways, causing significant road transport disruption, and the arrival in Barcelona was timed to coincide with the region-wide general strike and protest called by a number of Catalonian-based labour unions. Authorities estimate that over 500,000 people took part in the protest in Barcelona, in an action that effectively shut down the city. Another large protest is planned in Barcelona this Saturday, with smaller demonstrations having taken place throughout the region each day in between. However, despite these organisations being extremely vocal about the need for peaceful protest, a core of participants have engaged in rioting as the demonstration on October the 18th ended and night fell. This was the 5th consecutive night of violence following the sentencing announcement, marking a trend shift in the largely peaceful protests of the last 2 years. Security services claim that the violence is generally carried out by a younger group of protesters using social media to coordinate their activity. These protesters use apps such as Telegram and Twitter to communicate locations of activists and police in real time, enabling participants to counteract typical security force responses by organising large actions at short notice, setting up barricades in strategic locations, targeting under-resourced police deployments, or quickly regrouping in a nearby location once they have been disbanded. The violence tends to take place during the night, and though it has subsided from last Sunday, it is more likely to occur at larger weekend protests, and authorities have stated they expect clashes to resume from today through at least Sunday. In the most dramatic example of this kind of protest, around 10,000 pro-independence activists descended on Barcelona El Prat airport on the same day as the guilty verdict, in response to a call put out on social media by an anonymous group called Democratic Tsunami. Airlines were forced to cancel around 110 flights as protesters swamped the terminal and blocked airport access roads. Security forces employed riot control tactics, including rubber bullets and tear gas, in an attempt to end the siege, resulting in at least 115 injuries. Democratic Tsunami has claimed that they seek to emulate the sustained and disruptive anti-government protests currently taking place in Hong Kong, and to that end created a purpose-built app to help activists coordinate protest activity and confound security forces. Despite the group releasing statements condemning the violence of the protests, activists have continued to use social media tools to coordinate during riots and clashes. One typical use has been to target transport infrastructure throughout the region at short notice by sporadically blocking rail lines and major highways. But of greater concern is the way that violent protesters have regularly used social media tools to begin clashes with police following the conclusion of establishment protests, capitalising on the heightened tension and the number of activists already gathered in the area, and evolving into the nightly riots we have seen in Barcelona. Of course, it's important to note that support for independence is not absolute, even within Catalonia, and is largely unpopular in the rest of Spain. Spanish unionist civil society groups and political parties held a demonstration in Barcelona on the 20th, attended by around 1,500 people, and the follow-up protests are likely to gather greater participation as planned this Sunday. While these demonstrations are unlikely to involve a similar core of protesters willing to use violence, they may be targeted by hardline pro-independence activists. So regarding the impact for clients, while the current wave of civil unrest is ongoing, the primary threat for business and travellers is becoming caught up in the violence during any protests. Although bystanders are unlikely to be targeted by participants or security forces, they would face a significant indirect physical threat of harm. The largest demonstrations, and those most likely to escalate to violence, will take place in Barcelona. And within the city itself, the majority of protests tend to occur within the Eixample and Ciutat Vella districts, or very nearby. This is because these areas contain major squares and thoroughfares that can accommodate large numbers of people, and because they are the location of many of the Spanish government's regional delegations. As mentioned, as clashes tend to follow major protests, these areas have also been the centre of the riots in Barcelona. Particular hotspots for the violence have been the following major roads: Passeig de Gracia, Carrer de Mallorca, and the Via Laietana, and the central squares, Plaça Catalonia or Plaça Urquinaona. Maps including these locations and future protests are available in our alerts. And so it's the centrality of these locations within Barcelona and the number of tourist sites and businesses in the vicinity that makes it easy for an unaware traveller to find themselves caught up in a demonstration and any related violence. Lleida, Girona and Tarragona have also seen large demonstrations and repeated violence, typically occurring in central squares and outside the Spanish government sub-delegation buildings. As mentioned, neither protesters nor security forces are likely to deliberately target bystanders during any clashes. However, the majority of tactics used by both are imprecise, and a tense atmosphere can cause people to make irrational or dangerous decisions. For example, rioters in Barcelona have been setting fire to property, building barricades, and throwing projectiles at security force deployments. But fires can easily spread out of control. Projectiles can miss targets, posing a danger to bystanders who may have become caught between barricades and police. Additionally, security forces typically respond to violence and protests with force, using non-lethal riot control measures in an attempt to disperse participants. The Spanish police are well resourced and have shown they will not hesitate to use rubber bullets, water cannon, tear gas, and baton charges against unruly protesters. And again, any bystanders in the wrong place at the wrong time could easily be on the receiving end of these measures. This is a particular threat during any violence in Barcelona, as the ability for participants to coordinate their action through social media has resulted in running battles with police on multiple streets. Even non-lethal methods such as these do have the potential to cause significant injury. The clashes have already resulted in hundreds of injuries, and at least 4 people have reportedly lost an eye. Transport and supply chain disruptions also form a less immediate threat for business and travellers, but are still something to remain vigilant towards. As well as the protest that temporarily shut down Barcelona airport on October the 14th, groups on social media have targeted rail and road infrastructure throughout the region. A number of rail lines have been blocked or cut by protesters, and highways have been targeted by some sustained roadblock protest, particularly sections of the AP7 and AP2 highways. The fact that these are organised through social media means they can take place at very short notice, such as the one at Barcelona, and if causing severe disruption, they are likely to prompt the police to intervene forcibly. Moving on to the outlook, the Spanish general election scheduled for November the 10th, and the horse trading between political parties that will follow is likely to lend the current wave of civil unrest momentum through at least mid-November, and we can expect surges in protest activity following any significant developments relating to the sentencing in particular, or the issue of Catalonian independence more broadly. Pro-independence organisations are likely to use this momentum to organise multiple large-scale protests. For example, a major demonstration is currently planned on Carrer de la Marina in Barcelona this Saturday. And as we have discussed, it's these kind of gatherings which are liable to devolve into violence and riots during the night. Political and public opinion in the rest of Spain is unfavourable towards the issue of Catalonian independence, and as a result, conciliation measures by the Spanish government that could knock the wind out of the movement's sails are unlikely at the best of times. These measures are even less likely in the run-up to a general election when the government is fighting for votes and may have to build a coalition with hardline unionist parties in the near future, many of which have already called for Madrid to impose direct rule on Catalonia. So the top line is that with compromise being unlikely by either side, de-escalation over time through the natural attrition that affects most protest movements seems like the likely outcome in the absence of significant events galvanising protesters. Large-scale pro-independence protests will likely take place regularly at weekends during the election period, with a propensity to escalate to violence, though the current level of attendance at daily protests is unlikely to be sustainable. Additionally, prolonged disruption could result in counter-demonstrations from unionist groups and apolitical parties who simply want the protests and the violence to end.
Thank you, Ben. Next, we'll be hearing from Tony Rocca. Tony works as a senior security advisor with WorldAware's Global Assistance and Response team. Prior to joining Global Assistance and Response, he was a senior intelligence analyst focused on political violence and armed conflict. Tony is going to discuss preparedness tips for organizations and their employees operating in the region. Tony?
Yep, thanks, Mary. Thanks to Ben for that comprehensive sit rep as well. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening all. As Mary said, I'm going to discuss some general security recommendations and preparedness tips for organizations and their travelers operating in the region. When dealing with any kind of civil unrest, we want to be proactive and keep as much distance between ourselves and the protest sites as possible. If we find ourselves in the vicinity of a protest that turns violent, we're forced into reactive mode where the potential for seriously negative cascading effects is extremely high. So avoidance is the goal here. Clients with interest in Spain's Catalonia region need to maintain situational awareness at all times. Keep up to date on the current and upcoming protest locations, roadblocks, and any impending strikes that could lead to major service disruptions. Ben and his colleagues covering Western Europe do a good job alerting these issues, so ensure that all stakeholders are reading WorldAware's alerts and studying the attached maps closely. Also, liaise with WorldAware through the Access to Analyst program. Communicate with trusted local contacts, monitor all your internal message traffic, and conduct regular calls with internal emergency response teams if you have them in place in the region. Organizations should consider implementing a work from home or a work from hotel policy. Obviously, that involves ensuring you have contracts in place with hotels or residential building managers to ensure you have guaranteed access to the working space, living space that you require. Organizations considering a work from home policy should also ensure personnel are adequately equipped with multiple forms of communication, remote access capability, and backup power supplies. Personnel also need to have access to adequate supplies of food, water, and medication. If you haven't already done so, develop a robust communications plan to ensure you can gain rapid accountability of all personnel operating in Catalonia and in the neighboring regions if the situation deteriorates. As always, local cell networks, internet providers, and radio platforms spanning multiple frequency bands should serve as primary and alternate methods of communication, but ensure you have an emergency communications plan in place as well in the event electronic forms of communication are ineffective or disabled for whatever reason. Have designated communications windows for safety check-ins and clear escalation procedures for when designated communications windows are missed. Escalation procedures should include mechanisms to conduct face-to-face wellness checks and thresholds for activating emergency contact notification procedures. Ensure your people are also bracing for increased security posture, as Ben mentioned. Minimize nighttime movement and prepare for curfews in many major cities in Catalonia. As such, ensure that you're allowing extra time for commuting in the region, especially to and from the airport. If confronted by security forces for whatever reason, comply with all instructions immediately and do not attempt to bypass a security cordon. As always and everywhere, even an accidental breach of a security cordon, especially near a protest site, may prompt security forces to respond aggressively. When traveling through the airport at El Prat in Barcelona specifically, don't linger in the public areas. Get out of the public spaces, the check-in kiosks, rental car facilities, taxi stands, baggage claim, etc., as fast as possible. If you're flying out of El Prat, you want to get behind the security gates as fast as possible. If you're flying into El Prat, make sure you have a detailed reception plan in place to minimize the time spent in exposed areas. So ensure that the precise link-up location, the name, contact information, and photo of your driver, as well as the make, model, and tag number of their vehicle is communicated well in advance of any travel to the region. When traveling through Catalonia, either on foot or in a vehicle, ensure that you have multiple you've planned, memorized, and utilized multiple routes. As always, there are no shortages of stressors that could disrupt travel plans. So ensuring we know where we are at all times, where we need to go, and having multiple ways to get there will help mitigate vulnerabilities during transit. If we are maintaining situational awareness and we understand the layout of the region, we can plan routes that circumvent common flashpoints or protest sites or other choke point areas in the region. So study local maps and make mental notes of alternate routes, as well as possible safe havens, hotels, hospitals, shopping centers, coffee shops along each route. However, we want to avoid lingering near security checkpoints or cordons, as well as government buildings, as these could be targets of protest violence. Quick note on safe havens: understanding that it's not always possible. The ideal safe haven is a location that's open 24 hours a day. So again, we're looking at shopping centers, coffee shops, hotel lobbies, public transportation depots, hospitals, gas stations, etc. The idea is to allow us to arrive without any time restrictions and loiter for long periods while we attempt to coordinate secure transport back to our home, our hotel, or our office. If possible, look for locations that have commercial security on site, locations that have multiple points of ingress and egress, preferably along 2 or more different streets. Proximity to mass transportation is also ideal, so if needed, personnel can make a hasty exit prior to their link up time if the situation deteriorates further. If for whatever reason you happen to be caught up in a protest, attempt to detach yourself from the group without drawing attention to yourself. Keep a low profile by mimicking the actions of the group while simultaneously moving to the rear or the outer edge of the crowd. Exit as quickly as possible down a side street or into a shop. Remember though, try to avoid government buildings and police cordons, police checkpoints, police stations. If you do find yourself in the vicinity of a major clash and you happen to come in contact with any riot control agents, move into the wind and do your best to distance yourself from nearby demonstrators. Continue moving into the wind until you reach fresh air and flush eyes with clean water for at least 15 minutes. If you're wearing contacts, remove them and don't reinsert. Remove any contaminated clothing, but try to avoid pulling your shirts and your coats over your head. You want to wash contaminated skin and eyeglasses with soap and water, but avoid, I say again, avoid oil-based solutions or solutions that contain bleach. Contaminated clothing should be discarded or thoroughly washed several times with cold water, and seek medical attention if breathing difficulties or eye or skin irritation persists. This next slide drills down a little bit further and covers individual travel preparation. We don't have time to go over it in too much detail, and the checklist is not exhaustive by any means, but this makes a good reference for travel planning purposes. A quick note on the go bag. Ideally, some sort of go bag is part of your everyday carry already, but it is especially important to have on hand if you're traveling in a dynamic environment. At a minimum, go bags need to have all key identification, important contact information, and travel documents to include an exit visa if applicable. Credit cards and cash, preferably enough to sustain you for at least a 96-hour travel period. Any required medication with your physician's prescription, if applicable. Extra communications devices and power supplies, high energy snacks, bottled water, water treatment, and a flashlight with extra batteries and some rain gear as well. Finally, now is as good a time as any for risk managers and EHS personnel in the region to audit their local emergency response plans. And when I say emergency response plans or emergency action plans, I'm specifically referring to those plans designed to meet duty of care requirements and facilitate and organize actions to ensure employee life safety in the event of a specific workplace emergency. Again, ERPs are location-specific, tactical level responses to specific stressors. Ensure the plans are exercised regularly and come up with an improvement plan if you find your ERPs are non-existent or ineffective, to avoid having to rely entirely on ad hoc and informal corrective actions. Risk managers should also take the time to review any and all applicable insurance policies, specifically your business travel accident policies. But remember that insurance is just a funding tool. It is not a plan. If you need assistance drafting your ERPs, do not hesitate to contact WorldAware at any time. We'll be happy to give you a quote. With that, I'll wrap up. Thank you very much for your time. Stay safe. Back to you, Mary.
Thank you, Tony and Ben, and thank you for listening to our briefing. If you would like more information, please visit www.worldaware.com.